Hi, so finally, after a few weeks, I've got part 3 of my Eugenics and Psychiatry series. I thought I would be able to get all the information of pre-1800 psychiatry, but unfortunately the more I've been going through materials and books, the more it's transpired that actually we need a few more parts to even get to 1800. So if you remember part 2, I discussed Thomas Malthus with an essay on the principle of population. And the reason I took that is I took that book as the reference point as it came out in, well, that essay came out in 1798. So rounded it up to 1800. And it's a very good marker, purely a marker to start discussing that subject. And the idea is I was going to discuss all psychiatry up to 1800, up to him, because he's the one, that little book here is what started the modern eugenics movement, and then continue from that point. So as I started to look at mental health in antiquity and prior to 1800, I knew there was a lot, and I couldn't do it in one go. So I've split it in Greco-Roman psychiatry, then medieval psychiatry, then Renaissance, and then 1700, 1800, and 1900 we're back to Thomas Malthus. Some of the key books I've been using are Thomas South's Manufacture of Madness, written in 1970. He was a professor of psychiatry in the US. And A Short History of Psychiatry, written by a very pro-psychiatry historian and psychiatrist, Erwin Akonek, and that was written in 1956, and that's available on Internet Archive. Excuse me. The difference between the two is this exposes the evil of psychiatry, written by a psychiatrist, and this book exalts the virtue of psychiatry as if it was wonderful, and some of the examples in there are shocking and would make anybody very sick in the stomach, but apparently it's brilliant. So with those two books, we'll go on to Greco-Roman psychiatry, keeping in mind you, that the word psychiatry only came into existence in 1806, coined by a German physician, again, always seems to go back to German physician called Johannes Riehl. So when I talk about pre-1800 psychiatry, I'm really talking about the handling and the dealing of patients and people who are suffering from some mental difficulties, which at the time was considered not necessarily physical, unfortunately. But back in antiquities, when somebody had epilepsy or seizures, people considered that it was a punishment from the gods, for example, or they were afflicted by a demon, all that sort of things, a lot of superstition. So this is how it was back in antiquities. But around 400 BC, at the time of Hippocrates, he came up with, and he wrote about this, what was called the sacred disease, which was epilepsy and seizures. And he wrote a treatise on that called On the Sacred Disease, and basically made a point that it wasn't demons, it wasn't God or godly punishment. It was really from some physical causes. And Hippocrates, the first person who came up with the theory of the 4 humours, which I'll tell you in a sec what it is, which I knew the 4 humours already, and I hadn't realised actually Hippocrates had come up with that theory, but I knew that Galen had taken Hippocrates' theory and then expanded it, and Galen was a Roman physician. Now, interestingly enough, to keep in mind, is the theory of the 4 humours was not contested for at least 1500 years, until well into, the 1800s even. So what's interesting is that medicine never progressed during those 1500 years because of the fixed and false theory of Galen. Now, Galen didn't intend to have a false theory. He really believed what he said, but nobody contested it. And unfortunately, it's false. So the 4 humours, so humour, the actual meaning of the word humour is a liquid. Actually, it's a liquid or fluid, bodily fluid from a plant or an animal. And the theory of the 4 humours came from Hippocrates at first, and were further developed by Galen in 150 AD, and remained in use unquestioned for almost 2,000 years, up until the 19th century. Anyway, the theory stated that the body was made up of 4 humours, liquids or fluids. So blood, phlegm, a liquid released by coughing or sneezing, black bile, a dark liquid released by vomiting, and yellow bile, a light liquid released by vomiting. And each of these humours affected the body in different ways. It was believed that the properties of each of these humours corresponded with each of the 4 seasons, each humour dominating in the season which shared the same nature. Blood, hot and wet, predominates in spring, yellow bile, hot and dry in summer, black bile, cold and dry in autumn, and phlegm, cold and wet in winter. So the idea of bloodletting and those sorts of practices that we hear from that time is based on the 4 humours. So it's worth noting, because you're going to hear about these 4 humours for about 2,000 years of the recounting that I'm going to do until somebody actually questions it. Right. So Hippocrates came up with that. Epilepsy and seizures are not caused by demons or gods. But then there is very little in terms of documentation that still exists. And both those books actually discuss that. Obviously, because it's around 2,000 years ago. But what does still exist, the only data they have really is from 4 different individuals, actual data on the mental health. A chap called Celsus, around 30 AD. Another one called Soranus of Ephesus, circa 100 AD. Aratus of Cappadocia, circa 150 AD. And Celius Aurelianus, around 2nd century AD. Now, this chap, Celius Aurelianus, what he did, though, he did a very good translation of Soranus's works, and that translation survived. And there's been a further translation in English published in the 1950s. So it's quite interesting. So that's the only solid, complete material to discuss that era. And part of those 2 volumes of information, a little bit is mentioned on mental health. It's not all about mental health. It's just about medicine in general, but there's a little bit on mental health. But what's interesting here is, as discussed in those 2 books, and actually it's mentioned in this one, funnily enough, it does say here that unlike today in the 21st century, the source of the problem was not considered to be the brain. That's interesting, isn't it? Because at the time, the existence of the soul was fully accepted. But they had 3 main mental illnesses. They divided the problem in 3 main difficulties. And some of these now we know what they're caused by. First one was phrenitis, from the Greek phren, which means diaphragm or mind, and itis, inflammation. And basically it was an inflammation of the brain, frenzy. And symptoms included high fever, severe headache, neck pain, insomnia, and hallucinations. Symptoms now known to be symptoms of infections such as encephalitis, inflammation of the brain, meningitis, inflammation of the protective membrane of the brain, and spinal cord. So these are examples, and that was called phrenitis. So somebody's obviously suffering from some serious inflammation and were very, very ill. Now, think before, they would have thought gods or demons were attacking that poor soul, but really they were suffering quite badly physically. Then we have Soranus, so both Soranus and Aurelianus. So these are the 2 main people I'm going to talk about, is Soranus and Aurelianus, because they had the main people who wrote the works, or whose works remain on the subject. Now, what's interesting is both of them recommended for phrenitis quiet isolation in a warm and airy room, well lit or darker, depending on the state of the patient. Also quietness, change the treatment as fits the patient. Gentle and careful fettering of the patient was to be used, and only if necessary. There was nobody to attend to him. Warm poultices of oil applied to the head, and passive exercises such as rocking and a careful diet were indicated. Now, Soranus advocated bloodletting and leeching, with little leeches, but Aurelianus did not. Now, the next illness was mania. Or mania in French. So it's just the Greek mania. It actually comes from the Greek mania, which just means madness, literally madness. So here we have some really interesting information. So the manifestation are said by Soranus to include fury, gaiety, sadness, silliness, or anxiety, such as, for example, a persistent fear of falling into ditches. So a phobia. You know, some people are afraid of going down the stairs or going in a lift. So falling into ditches, it is said that some patients were unable to visit underground chambers on account of this fear. Other manifestations were patients in deluded states where they may see themselves as sparrows, cockerels, earthenware, vessels, gods, orators, actors, grains of corn, the center of the universe, or as infants. And their eyes were noticeably bloodshot and their body tight and tense. But Soranus did not believe that mania was a disease of the soul, but had physical causes. Now, it's quite interesting to see how the word mania just covered all those different, various mental upsets. You know, just one simple name. And, you know, the handling was the same. They advocated the same treatment as phrenitis, but with extras. And this is really fascinating. It goes to show the different frame of minds. So listening to dripping water in case of insomnia, massage, going for walks. Now imagine if that's the kind of treatment that were done in psychiatric hospitals today for the patients. That's not happening today. Today it's coercion, it's violence, it's drugs, it's electric shock. But here we have, going for walks. And then, I love this, massage, and then maintaining and reinforcing the patient's reasoning powers and critical thinking abilities through discussion, asking questions, getting them to read and criticize texts which contain false statements, spending time in light reading, play acting, delivering speeches to a friendly audience, as well as playing checkers and traveling. Such activities encourage improving the patient's outlook and extroversion towards his surroundings. Traveling, of course, is an ideal solution to stress and life's upsets, because if you're in an environment that's horrible, or you have some toxic personalities around you, I mean, the best thing is to change environment, and usually a person will feel a lot better. The moment a person's no longer, around a toxic personality, they usually start to feel a lot better. Anyway, so that was their recommended solutions on top of the one for phrenitis, a good diet, etc. And then the third illness was melancholia, which is what we would now say as depression. So it comes from Greek melas, which means black, and chole, bile or black bile, because it was the belief that melancholia was caused by the black bile humor. Yeah? And black bile caused gloominess, irritability, or depression. So Soranus did not believe that melancholia was caused by black bile. He considered that it occurred most commonly in men in their prime, and that it could be caused by drugs. Drugs, now, they already had opium and other drugs in those days. So drugs, grief, fear, and digestive upsets. And this is what I find amazing, is even at that time, there was obviously an awareness that your gut and gut problems were a causing upsets in people. And this is exactly, this is knowledge of 2,000 years ago, which disappeared, and only just now it's coming back up. And it's well known, it's proven, the gut biome problem in the, in the digestive system are some of the primary causes for, deep upsets and mental health problems. And I'm doing this simply because of the psych book that I show you normally, which will call it a mental health or a mental disorder, but actually the person is physically ill. There's something wrong with their guts. So here you go. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? And at the time, what is really interesting is the fact that Soranus rejected his contemporaries, so other contemporaries at the time, and this is written in a translation, I believe. Soranus rejected his contemporaries' therapeutic treatment of the mentally unwell, such as darkness, starvation, continuous fettering, opium, excessive bloodletting, enemata, which is a plural of enema, putting liquid up the backside to clean out the, evacuation, alcohol, whipping, music, and sex. On the other hand, Celsus therapy, so we just hear Celsus here, so there's another guy called Celsus, but this is from their text. Celsus's therapies including menaces, torture, whipping, and sudden brutal ducking. Now, ducking into water, whipping, this has continued to exist until very, very recently. We've got worse stuff now. But that's not, you know, that was already being done back 2,000 years ago. And this is quite interesting. It says, not unlike Soranus, Caelius Aurelianus also strongly advocated against violent treatment, recommending humane and compassionate care and treatment along the same lines as Soranus. Quiet, well-lit space, mind-engaging activities, etc., etc. So what is really amazing is how you have 2,000 years ago, and you already had this conflict going on with those that would truly help those mentally unwell, and those that would, I don't know, get satisfaction out of I don't know, what would you call these people? There's people that get a lot of pleasure out of inflicting pain on others. I mean, sadists, I suppose. You know, they work in the field of mental health, not to really help others, it's to pretend, but it's to get a kick out of being able to control or commandeer or dominate other person. I think that's what happens there. But there's a translation here of a statement made by Aurelianus in his books, and it says this: they, his medical colleagues, they seem mad themselves. So he's talking about his people 2,000 years ago who are looking after the mentally ill, and he's saying they're mad, like we have now. Psychiatry, they're mad. So they seem mad themselves, rather than disposed to cure their patients, when they compare them to wild beasts, to be tamed by deprivation of food and the tortures of thirst. Doubtless led by the same error, they want to chain them up cruelly, without thinking that their limbs may be bruised or broken, and that it is more convenient and easier to restrain them by the hand of man than the often useless weight of irons. They go so far as to advocate personal violence, the lash, the whip, as if to compel the return of reason by such provocations. And this is what I love, is this idea that by inflicting torture on the mentally ill, suddenly their reason is going to return. And I've read in this book, I haven't got much time now because it's overrunning, but it's got examples in there with Darwin's grandfather and some of the treatments he was giving patients, and it's shocking. And it's cruel. It's cruel, this idea that suddenly people are going to come back to reason because you're going to dunk them in water or whip them or spin them on that chair. You know, do you remember that chair I talked about? Until the person bleeds from the nose and the mouth, and then they're cured. Anyway, so it's amazing. It's amazing that 2,000 years ago, we have the same problem that's going on now. Decent people wanting to help, trying to find a solution, and some seriously evil buggers. And what's amazing here is, I did make another post recently on this, what's happening in the EU. What is amazing is that coercion and involuntary commitment in psych hospital is getting worse right now. And there was that report from the EU Commission, the European Parliamentary Assembly. I did a post on that, so you can go back to it. But France is reported to be one of the European countries with the highest rates of involuntary placements. Isn't that amazing? And we even have England, where England now, more than 50% of admissions to psych hospitals in England are coerced. They're involuntary. The person is forced into a psychiatric hospital. So anyway, and coercive methods include obviously mechanical restraints, being strapped to a bed frame, physical restraints, being held down by staff, and seclusion, being locked in a small room. Exactly what these people were objecting to 2,000 years ago. Isn't that extraordinary? So next section is going to be on medieval psychiatry. Now it gets darker. We're going to start going into the field of witch hunting.